Beijing on Wednesday was host to a massive military parade showing the strength of China's armed forces and its regional alliances. And throughout the ceremony, which was to commemorate 80 years since the defeat of Japan in the Second World War, President Xi Jinping was flanked by Vladimir Putin of Russia and Kim Jong-un of North Korea, and the leaders of Myanmar, Iran, Pakistan, Belarus, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia, among others, were also present. And in terms of the arms on display, China demonstrated for the first time its capacity to launch nuclear warheads from the land, sea, and air. Hypersonic, supersonic, and autonomous weapons were also in evidence. But the most visually striking element was a huge shipborne laser. Obviously, it's on a truck there, but it can be put on a ship. That state television said would be a key part of air defenses for the PLA Navy's surface fleet. Giant lasers. Drone and anti-drone gear was also seen as highlighting China's strength in technologies that could be vital in any future war over Taiwan. But in his speech, President Xi was key to put forward the message that China was interested in peace.
Today, humanity again has to choose between peace and war, dialogue and confrontation, win-win cooperation and zero-sum game. The Chinese people firmly stand on the right side of history and the progress of human civilization. We will remain committed to the path of peaceful development and join hands with all peoples around the world in building a community with a shared future for humanity.
That was Xi presenting China as a force for peace in the world. Some might suggest cozying up to Putin somewhat undermines that. But this comment in a Financial Times write-up of the parade struck me as important, actually. So it's from a professor of Chinese studies at King's College London. So it's called Kerry Brown. He says, it's all very performative talking about the parade. They can definitely march. They can put on a great parade. But they've not fought for many decades. It's a completely untested military. Now, I think that statement was supposed to show the limit of Chinese power, right? You know, these weapons might look good, but we don't know how they're actually usable in the theatre of war. But I think it also says something quite positive about China, right? It's remarkable to have this rising power that we're always told is a threat, yet whose main weakness is apparently that they haven't started enough wars. So I suppose I'd take that. Of course, that could change if China gains military dominance or greater military dominance. And some military analysts think that moment could be near. So Foreign Policy magazine today ran a piece suggesting China is now a world leader in terms of military technology. Sam Rojavine, a former senior analyst for the Australian intelligence agency, pointed to new stealth fighters, which were first spotted last year, and whose tailless design is believed could make them harder to pick up by radar, and to the development of a unique type of powered barge with extendable road bridges that could allow vehicle-carrying ships to unload their cargo at an unprepared coastal site. So this could infuriate any invasion of Taiwan. Now, add to this the new weapon systems displayed in Beijing on Wednesday, and the author concludes this. So he says it's no longer enough to say that China's military, the People's Liberation Army, is catching up or that it is copying foreign military equipment designs. China is now innovating and it is leading. In the process, the regional military balance that has for decades favored the United States and its partners is being irrevocably changed. The focus, though, on regional military balance is crucial for this argument, though. Rojavine writes this, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. Consider that China has not added to the single overseas base it opened in Djibouti in 2017. It is years away from fielding a bomber with intercontinental range, and it has nothing like the global alliance network of the United States. The new fighter aircraft, landing barges, drones, and missile systems that have emerged this year don't suggest an overwhelming focus on global power projection either. They will primarily strengthen China's position in its neighborhood. So he's saying, if they've got a military edge, it's regional, not global. Earlier today, I spoke to William Hurst in Beijing. William is the Chonghua Professor of Chinese Development at Cambridge University. We discussed China's growing military strength and its desired place in the world. But I began by asking a question about history. How Wednesday's military parade shows how China, or to what extent it shows that China wants to reframe the history of the Second World War.
I'm not sure China's reframing the history for a domestic audience. as much as it's trying to reframe a bit of it for an international audience. Domestically, it's more about underscoring a long-standing narrative about the centrality of the Second World War in shaping some of the dynamics of the Chinese Civil War and Chinese Revolution, and about the role of the Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army under the party's leadership in winning the war, winning the Civil War, achieving the revolution, and crafting today's China. For an international audience, I think there is a desire on the part of the Chinese government and the party to reframe a bit of the narrative to center the role of China and the role and the importance of World War II in Asia. And there's a consistent sort of discourse coming out of official organs in China that in the West, the war in Asia is being forgotten or is not sufficiently emphasized. I'm not sure that's true, particularly in North America, but that's what they're trying to say is basically the West has forgotten World War II in Asia. We want to re-emphasize that and re-emphasize the central role of China.
I mean, I suppose it's the war in Asia is not forgotten in the United States, but it's framed as, the Americans fought the Japanese and then the nuclear bomb was used and then it was won. And China saying what you've missed out is, our resistance fighters and the fact that 20 million Chinese were killed. So I suppose that's where they're coming from in this perspective.
Exactly. And even the fact that the war in China started 10 years before Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about the nature of this military parade in the sense, I suppose most people, you think of a military parade, you think that must be a very militaristic country, sort of the idea that you're showing all your weaponry through the streets. I suppose China would say they haven't fought any major wars in the past 40 years. If you compare China's rise to, say, the rise of other major global powers like Britain or the United States, this is a remarkably peaceful country. And so, I mean, what do you make of the claim that this is a military parade by a remarkably peaceful state?
That is, again, certainly how the Chinese government is portraying the parade in its own media and propaganda. But I think if you look at the history of China, particularly the conquest of what's now parts of southwestern China that used to be part of different Southeast Asian states prior to about the 1500s, maybe a little bit earlier, actually. And if you think about the dynamics in the South China Sea today, and many other sort of border disputes that China's had in even the recent history, for example, the 1962 war with India, it's not always been the case that China's been remarkably peaceful. In fact, the last significant war that China actually did fight was in 1979 when it invaded Vietnam, because Vietnam had invaded Cambodia to topple the Khmer Rouge, with whom China were aligned. So I think that there's not necessarily an entirely peaceful dynamic, and I think that many states in the region would not view China as entirely having peaceful intentions, even though it's trying to emphasize repeatedly that this is a demonstration of defensive capability.
Does that potentially underplay, though, the extent to which sort of the United States, which is often positioning China as this sort of revisionist power, has military bases all across the world? I think China has one international military base. And yeah, you have to go back quite far to sort of talk about expansion into the more Western parts of China that didn't used to be a part of it. So if you're looking in the nearer term, you've got the West, which I suppose Xi Jinping and his allies would say has been constantly sort of mounting expeditionary warfares around the world. And then you've got China, which is, to a greater or lesser extent, been keeping itself to itself and rising peacefully. You're quite dismissive of that narrative, though.
I wouldn't completely dismiss the narrative, nor would I underplay the extent to which Western powers were perhaps more violent and more ruthlessly expansionist at similar points in their history. But I would just emphasize, for example, the South China Sea story, in that, in just the last 30 years, China has constructed artificial islands and indeed built military installations there in areas that it claims are part of its sort of inland water or internal waters or territorial waters, but which everyone else thinks of as either being international waters or, in fact, as being in the exclusive economic zones of Southeast Asian states like the Philippines. So from the perspective of some states, China is not peaceful and non-expansionist even now.
what's the situation? I know you're an expert when it comes to sort of the Southeast Asian states. I know Indonesia were there at this military parade. Were the Philippines not there, presumably? I mean, what is China's current relations with its regional neighbors?
It depends which ones. So I think if we look at Southeast Asia as a whole, and you're talking about many different countries, there are a few states, notably Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia, all of which did send high-level representatives to the parade, which have a strong positive relationship, almost to the point of dependency, with China. The rest of Southeast Asia has, to varying degrees, a degree of an amount of security ambivalence, or ambivalence about China when it comes to their security, but a very strong economic relationship, and vice versa. China actually has ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, as its most important and largest trading partner, and that relationship's expanding quite rapidly. So the option of delinking on the economic front isn't there for Southeast Asian countries, yet there is a great degree of concern in many countries in Southeast Asia about China as a security threat. And China perceives its security to be not entirely assured in the South China Sea and across Southeast Asia. So there's a lot of tension and a lot of different degrees of nuance there. If we think about Indonesia coming to the parade, or the president of Indonesia, actually, Prabowo Subianto, coming to the parade, the one reason why that is notable, there are the two reasons actually. One is that Indonesia historically has been among the countries that has been more ambivalent about China in security terms. And Prabowo Subianto seems to be moving towards a less ambivalent, more comfortable position in terms of the way he views China on security, at least slightly. But also Indonesia has been racked by massive protests and riots across at least 10 different cities over the last 5 or 6 days. And so in the context of this domestic political instability, Prabowo had decided, as recently as a day or two ago, that he would not come to China for the parade. He would have to stay in Indonesia to handle the crisis that's going on there. Notably because in 1998, when Suharto traveled to Egypt in the middle of a similar crisis, that's when his regime fell. So mindful of that, Prabowo did not wish to leave Indonesia at this time. He did, at the last minute, apparently find enough confidence to leave and to come to the parade. And it was announced with some fanfare on Chinese television this morning that he had landed in the early hours and made it just in time to be at the parade. And he had a televised entrance on the red carpet among the other leaders of, I think, 26 or 27 countries who came.
And from a military perspective, I know sort of part of the point of the parade was to demonstrate China's military prowess. Was there any particular types of technology that stood out to you? I suppose another argument is that this wasn't so much about saying our military is better than the Americans' military, but all of this has been made in China. So it's sort of showing off their industrial base to some extent.
There was some commentary on Chinese television after the parade that did suggest that China's military is now at least equal to any other in the world. In other words, that there's no military better than China's or stronger than China's, according to some of these analysts on Chinese television. I don't know if there's any real merit or not in such arguments, and I'm not an expert on military technology per se. But what did strike me watching the parade is that many of the formations that passed the reviewing stand were not from traditional parts of the armed forces, right? So normally you'd have the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, etc. And they did have that in large numbers. But then they also had different sort of sub-commands for different kinds of equipment. Anti-drone formation passed by with all kinds of anti-drone technology. Another cyber warfare formation. Something else about space and space militarization or weapon capacity in space. So I think there was a different organization to the way that the military presented itself in public this time, which struck me as somewhat notable. I'm less expert on, for example, some of the nuclear missiles that were displayed, again, according to Chinese television, were apparently of a new generation and better, longer range, more capable of targeting multiple targets, etc., than earlier publicly displayed Chinese missiles, but I wouldn't be able to know exactly how much that makes a difference.
I suppose most of the focus, you've talked about Indonesia and some other Southeast Asian countries, most of the focus from the West when it comes to this military parade has been Xi, Kim Jong-un, and Vladimir Putin. And I suppose I wanted to know from you, is that a particular Western focus to sort of see that triad as the key relationship here, or is that something which is also being emanated from Beijing, that this is a really important alliance between those three nations? Sorry.
China does have one alliance with North Korea. It's had that since before the Korean War. China would probably like to be free of that alliance. North Korea is always not always the best ally to be stuck with. So I would emphasize it's not an alliance per se. And China and Russia actually don't trust or like each other as much as I think a lot of observers from outside think that they do. But it was notable in all of the domestic media reports that I saw, as well as in the live broadcast, that Putin and Kim were emphasized and were given sort of pride of place in the order of precedence as everyone went in and where they sat in the reviewing stand. So, I do think that there's a strong emphasis on that. Definitely, it was notable that Kim Jong-un came, and that was also noted by a number of observers and commentators, both inside China and outside, because he often would not come for these things. He travels abroad quite seldom. So I think there was an emphasis on that, definitely. And certainly there's an attempt by China to make sure that Russia is supported sufficiently and is sufficiently able to survive the war in Ukraine that it started, as well as other situations around the world that Russia finds itself confronted with, so as to still be able to balance the United States and Japan, right? And more notable, I think, than what happened at the parade, in fact, was that Modi attended the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin over the past weekend. And there was given quite a warm reception. So China and India historically have had quite a bad relationship. They've gone to war in 1962, and since then there have been skirmishes on the border as recently as just a few years ago, just during COVID, I believe it was, that this was still happening on the border. And since the Ukraine war, there's been a concerted effort, I think, by China to kind of bring India back in from the cold, in large part because the concern historically had always been India's moving too close to Russia, and China and Russia had a bad relationship, or the Soviet Union before Russia even. And so it was important to try to weaken India to make sure that Russia would not be able to sort of flank China from both north and south. Today, with Russia under threat and in a potentially weak position, and India threatening basically to move closer to the West, the concern since the start of the Ukraine war especially has been to make sure India does not feel obliged to move too close to the West and stays close with Russia and helps support Russia, again, to keep balancing the US and Japan and to a lesser extent Europe. So Modi coming was even more notable, I think, than Kim Jong-un coming. And the reception that Modi received was, I think, deliberately very positive and warm.
And I suppose, I mean, it is a crude reading. So Modi turns up to the summit, which was mainly about economic cooperation, but he doesn't turn up to the military parade. Can we sort of say India and China are economic allies, but still military rivals? I mean, obviously, I'm simplifying here, but is there something to that?
I think that would have been a step too far, perhaps, to actually show up and be seated at the parade. Remember, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization actually at base is really about counterterrorism and security rather than economic. They're trying to shift the focus more towards economics, but basically it's a security framework from its inception. It's notable because it includes a wide variety of states that don't always see eye to eye on security issues, not least both India and China. But yes, I do think the fact that he didn't stay and go to the parade is probably a statement that he's not comfortable getting that close to China. I think China would have been very happy to have Modi at the parade, but I think he would have seen it as a bridge too far.